What if everything you thought you knew about safety, trust, and the world around you could shatter in an instant? What if a simple, everyday moment, like driving to school, became a nightmare that changed everything forever? On May 21st, 2021, a devastating tragedy unfolded on the 55 freeway in Orange County, a moment that would forever alter the lives of a family and an entire community. A life was stolen in broad daylight, and the question remains, was this truly just a random act of violence, or was there something more behind it? The truth behind this heartbreak runs deeper than the headlines. What if the answers we've been given are only scratching the surface? What if the answers we think we have leave us with even more questions? The events of that fateful day shattered not only a family but an entire sense of security. A young life, full of promise, was ripped away in an instant. As we uncover the hidden truths, piece together the investigation, and explore the untold story, you'll discover that the reality is far more complex, more devastating, than anyone could have imagined. The story of Aiden Leos. Imagine a world where everything you know and love can be stolen in a single, violent instant, a world where a simple, everyday moment turns into a nightmare. Aiden Leos wasn't just a name on a police report or a face in the news. On May 21st, 2021, Aiden Leos, a 6-year-old boy full of laughter, curiosity, and boundless potential, had everything to live for. But in the blink of an eye, that life was ripped away. A tragedy that no one saw coming shattered a family and sent shockwaves through a community. What was supposed to be just another morning on the road became the heart-wrenching moment that changed everything. And in the aftermath, questions lingered. How could this happen? Why did it happen? And what is the true story behind Aiden's tragic death? Aiden was, in many ways, a typical 6-year-old, full of life and wonder, with a mind that was always discovering new things. He loved to race his toy cars, pretending they were real, zipping across the floor with his little hands steering them along imaginary tracks. Aiden had a special way of making anything he touched seem alive, whether it was a new set of cars, a puzzle, or even just the way he ran in circles around the house. His bright brown eyes sparkled with excitement every time he found something new to play with, and his energy never seemed to run out. But Aiden wasn't just about play, he was about love. Aiden adored his mother, Joanna Clunan, more than anything. His mother had been his constant companion, his protector, his rock, his greatest support, the person who shaped the little boy he had become, and the person who made the world feel safe. Joanna and Aiden shared an incredibly close bond. He was always there beside her, holding her hand as they went about their day-to-day routines. He was a loving son, so eager to please and quick to show affection, with the kind of innocent trust that only a child can have. When Aiden smiled, his whole face lit up, and those around him couldn't help but smile back. Joanna often talked about how Aiden had a way of making even the dullest moments special. Whether it was a quiet evening at home, playing board games together, or just sitting in the living room watching a cartoon, Aiden made it all feel meaningful. He loved simple things, running around in the yard, collecting rocks, making up songs, and talking to the family dog, who he treated like his best friend. Aiden's world was full of innocence and excitement. He was a child who loved with his whole heart, and everything he did with passion. Aiden was also incredibly smart for his age. His teachers at school always praised him for his curiosity and quick grasp of new concepts. He was excited about learning, and you could always find him asking questions about the world around him, eager to understand how things worked. He had an unending thirst for knowledge, constantly filling his mind with new facts, ideas, and stories. His world was full of possibilities, and he was just beginning to experience the magic of it all. Joanna's partner, Aiden's stepfather, had been with them for years, and though their family was small, it was full of love. The relationship between Aiden and his stepfather was considered positive, with the stepfather being a supportive figure in Aiden's life. They didn't have a lot of material wealth, but their home was filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of love that only a family can share. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was theirs, and they were content. They had a rhythm, a routine. Aiden would go to school, Joanna would work, and then they'd all come together at the end of the day to share dinner, stories, and sometimes even little celebrations over small victories. Life felt safe, and for Joanna, that sense of normalcy was something she cherished deeply. They had a quiet, peaceful life together, just a happy family navigating the world one day at a time. But that all changed on one fateful morning. The morning of May 21st, 2021, had started like any other. The air was fresh, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, as Joanna Clunan prepared for the day ahead. She moved through the familiar motions of getting Aiden ready for school, lacing his shoes, packing his bag, and reminding him of his schoolwork. Aiden, full of excitement for another day, was in the back seat, as usual, humming to himself and playing with his toy cars. Their morning routine felt safe, predictable, and filled with comfort. There was nothing to suggest that in a few short moments, everything would change. By the time they hit the 55 freeway, the days seemed to be unfolding smoothly. Aiden's school was just a short drive away, and Joanna had no reason to believe that anything was amiss. As they cruised along the freeway, the carpool lane offered a quick route to their destination. But within moments, something unusual began to unfold. It started with the sudden appearance of a white Volkswagen Golf sport wagon in their rearview mirror. The car was speeding, weaving dangerously through traffic, and it quickly closed the gap between them. What seemed like an ordinary, busy morning on the freeway began to shift into something far more alarming. The driver of the Volkswagen, agitated and speeding, swerved into Joanna's lane, cutting her off with a frighteningly close distance. It was a reckless move, one that made Joanna's heart race as she instinctively pulled back, trying to give herself some space. But the driver of the Volkswagen wasn't finished yet. In that moment, Joanna's hand instinctively went up, a brief, fleeting gesture of frustration as she motioned at the driver to back off. It was a small reaction, perhaps a natural response to feeling threatened. But it was enough to trigger something in the man behind the wheel of the Volkswagen. The car pulled alongside Joanna's vehicle, and for a brief moment, the two drivers locked eyes, strangers, yet somehow now locked in a high-stakes confrontation. In a flash, the Volkswagen sped ahead of them, only to slam on its brakes in front of Joanna's car. A dangerous game of cat and mouse was unfolding before them. What happened next, no one could have predicted. As Joanna tried to maneuver away from the situation, she felt her stomach tighten. She knew something wasn't right. The Volkswagen accelerated once more, but this time it didn't simply drive away. It followed them, closing in behind Joanna's car, now dangerously close. And then, without warning, the sound of a gunshot rang out. The bullet pierced the rear window of Joanna's car, striking Aiden, her 6-year-old son, who had been sitting quietly in the back seat. The world seemed to stop in that moment. Joanna didn't even realize what had happened at first. But then, Aiden's voice, soft, fragile, cut through the shock. "Ouch," Aiden said, his small hand clutching his chest. The horror of those words, the pain that followed them, shook Joanna to her core. She turned to see Aiden, the blood seeping through his fingers, the shock in his eyes. Panic surged through her as she swerved to the shoulder of the freeway, her hands trembling on the wheel. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she pulled over and reached for her son, cradling him in her arms. The sound of her own voice, frantic and pleading as she dialed 911, barely registered in her mind. "Please, please help me, my son is hurt." The moments that followed were a blur. The calm of the morning had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, crushing fear. Aiden's life had been torn away in an instant. By the time emergency responders arrived, Aiden had already been rushed to the hospital. Despite their best efforts, he was declared dead, just hours after a drive that should have been nothing more than a simple morning routine. Aiden, the little boy who had loved toy cars and bright days, was gone. Joanna's world had been shattered, her life forever altered in that horrifying moment. The community, too, was left reeling. This was not just a tragedy for a family, it was a loss that reverberated through everyone who had ever seen Aiden smile, who had watched him play in the park, or who had known him even in passing. This wasn't just another random act of violence, it was the death of an innocent child, a boy whose future was stolen before it could even begin. As Joanna sat in disbelief, the police launched an investigation into the shooting. The questions were endless. Why had Aiden been targeted? What had caused the driver of the Volkswagen to pull out a gun in broad daylight? Was it truly just an act of road rage, or was there something more to this senseless act? The community could hardly fathom that such an ordinary family, simply going about their day, had been thrust into this unimaginable tragedy. The question of why Aiden, why this family, haunted everyone who heard their story. What drove a man to make a split-second decision that took the life of an innocent child? But the truth behind this crime was more complicated than anyone could have guessed. And the search for answers was just beginning. The investigation was only just beginning. As the investigation unfolded, something shocking emerged. The police had a new lead, a tip that would change everything. One that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. A small detail, almost overlooked, that could change everything, but the real question remained. Would they be able to uncover the full story behind Aiden Leos' death, or was there more to this crime than anyone realized? Stay tuned, because the truth is far from what you may have imagined. Hours after Aiden Leos' tragic death, the investigation was already moving full speed ahead. The loss of a child had struck the community to its core, and law enforcement knew they had to act quickly. The pressure was immense, not just to find the person responsible, but to understand the deeper layers of this senseless act of violence. Was it just an outburst of road rage, or was there something more to the story? From the moment Aiden was struck, investigators began gathering crucial evidence. The scene was carefully examined, and the first signs of a breakthrough came from surveillance footage. Several cameras in the area had caught the moments leading up to the incident and the immediate aftermath. In these grainy images, a white Volkswagen was seen tailgating Joanna Cloonan's car before speeding off after the shot was fired. Though the images were unclear and the license plate was obscured, the authorities knew they had a vital lead. But the breakthrough didn't stop there. The emotional 911 call that Joanna made in those harrowing moments after Aiden was struck also became a pivotal piece of evidence. Her voice, shaking with fear and disbelief, described the chaos as she desperately called for help. "My son has been shot," Joanna's voice trembled, her words cutting through the air. "Please help me." In her call, she described the car that had been involved, its color, make, and the erratic behavior of its driver. The description matched what several eyewitnesses had reported. It was clear to the investigators, this wasn't a random incident. The shooting had been personal and deliberate, likely provoked by the heated exchange between the two vehicles. Despite these early clues, the investigation hit several roadblocks. The Volkswagen's license plate remained a mystery, and no immediate suspects emerged. Investigators felt the weight of the case pressing down on them. A child had been killed, and the community needed answers. But with no concrete leads, the case seemed to stall. That's when, almost out of nowhere, a tip came in. The breakthrough everyone had been hoping for arrived via an anonymous call to the police tip line. The caller, speaking with urgency, described a white Volkswagen Golf sport wagon, the same model involved in the shooting, and gave an important name, Marcus Anthony Arise. At first, the name didn't ring any bells, but it was the first real lead the investigators had. They immediately set to work, tracing Arise's name, digging into his history, and hoping that this was the key they had been waiting for. What the investigators discovered next was chilling. Marcus Arise, 26, had no criminal record, but his driving history told a different story. As they dug deeper, they found that he had been involved in several road rage incidents before. While none of these had led to charges, there were numerous reports of aggressive driving, instances where he had threatened other drivers, tailgate, and engaged in violent confrontations. This pattern of behavior suddenly made Arise a prime suspect. This wasn't just the act of a random driver, this was the act of someone with a history of violent outbursts behind the wheel. The police quickly shifted their focus to Arise. They began pulling up his phone records and tracing his movements on the day of the shooting. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed his white Volkswagen entering and leaving areas close to where Aiden was shot. The evidence was mounting, but investigators knew they needed more to make an arrest. They couldn't afford to rush, they had to be sure. Forensic analysis from the crime scene provided further corroboration. Ballistics tests confirmed that the bullet that struck Aiden came from a handgun, and gunshot residue found on the door of the Volkswagen further connected the vehicle to the crime. But even with this mounting evidence, the investigators couldn't shake one lingering question: why Aiden? Why had an innocent child been the target of such a brutal attack? As the police worked around the clock to gather more evidence, they turned their attention to Wen Lee, the woman who had been driving the Volkswagen on the day of the shooting. Lee, 23, appeared to be an unlikely accomplice to such a violent act. At first glance, she seemed quiet, mild-mannered, and ordinary, a stark contrast to the violent act that had unfolded. Yet, as the investigation into her life deepened, it became clear that Lee was more than just a bystander. Lee and Arise had been in a long-term relationship and had been living together in Costa Mesa. While she hadn't fired the fatal shot, it was clear that she had played a role in the escalation of the situation. Wen Lee had been the one to tailgate Joanna's vehicle, engaging in a calculated act of pursuit. She had allowed the tension between the two cars to build, creating the perfect opportunity for Arise to make his violent move. She wasn't just an innocent driver, she was a participant, enabling the tragic events that led to Aiden's death. The police also found further evidence linking Lee to the crime. Phone records revealed that in the hours leading up to the shooting, Arise and Lee had been in contact with each other, coordinating their actions. Security footage showed the two cars moving in tandem, confirming that this wasn't an accidental encounter, it was a deliberate and escalating act of aggression. The tension had been building for miles before the fatal shot was fired. As the pieces of the investigation came together, public reaction intensified. The community had already been shocked by Aiden's death, but now the realization that this was not just a random act of road rage, this was a targeted crime, stirred up even more anger. A child had been taken from his family in a senseless act of violence, and the entire town was clamoring for justice. Despite the growing pressure, investigators knew that they had to tread carefully. Aiden's family deserved justice, and the community demanded answers. But the investigation was far from over. Even with Arise's arrest and Lee's charges, there were still too many unanswered questions. With all the pieces falling into place, the investigation had revealed the basic facts: the who, what, when, and where, but the why remained an open question. What could have driven Marcus Arise to murder an innocent child? Was it truly just road rage, or was there something deeper, something buried in his past, his psyche, or his relationship with Wen Lee? The investigation revealed a lot about Marcus Aries, but to truly understand the crime, we had to look deeper, beneath the surface of his past and emotional makeup. Aries' history of aggressive driving didn't just point to a moment of road rage, it hinted at a man struggling with deeper issues of anger management. This wasn't just a one-time incident that spiraled out of control. Aries had a history of violent outbursts, but what was truly at play that day? Psychologically, Aries appeared to have long-standing emotional difficulties. A history of unresolved frustration and a quick temper revealed a person who didn't have the coping skills to deal with stress or confrontation. What was it that caused such an eruption of violence that day? Was it the traffic dispute that triggered it, or was it the emotional buildup of years of unaddressed anger? The road rage incident was a symptom, not the cause. At the time of the crime, Aries wasn't just reacting to a situation, he was acting out a pattern of behavior, a long cycle of impulse and emotionally driven actions. This crime didn't just happen in a split second. It had been building for a long time. This was the culmination of his volatile emotional state. The murder of Aiden was not an isolated act, but rather a violent eruption that had been waiting to happen. Win Lee, the enabler or willing partner. Win Lee's involvement in the crime seemed more complex than it initially appeared. At first glance, she seemed to be a mild-mannered, passive individual. However, as the investigation unfolded, it became evident that Lee was far more involved in the escalation of the incident than anyone had suspected. Lee and Aries were in a long-term relationship, but the investigation uncovered that she had enabled much of his aggressive behavior. Instead of questioning his violent tendencies, Lee had often gone along with his decisions, further fueling the tension. Her behavior that day, driving aggressively and tailgating Joanna Cloonan's vehicle, was a direct reflection of her complicity. Lee wasn't just a passenger, she was an active participant, allowing the situation to escalate to a fatal point. Psychologically, Lee seemed to be someone who had internalized a role of supporting Aries' actions. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or simply not recognizing the escalation in their behavior, she had become a passive enabler. When Aries reached his breaking point, Lee was right there with him, part of the chain of events that led to Aiden's death. Lee wasn't merely a driver in the wrong place at the wrong time, she played a critical role in enabling the violence. What made them snap? The question remains, what made Marcus Aries and Win Lee snap? Was it just a case of road rage, or was there something deeper driving them to commit such a brutal crime? The psychological profile of Aries suggested that he had been prone to explosive outbursts, but the real question was, what triggered him in this instance? The act wasn't merely about a momentary disagreement on the road, it was about Aries' inability to regulate his emotions, his unchecked anger, and the intensification of his aggressive tendencies over time. In contrast, Lee's role seemed to be that of an enabler, perhaps even an active participant. She seemed to have been completely complicit in the act, driving with Aries and allowing the events to unfold as they did. But what was behind her participation? Did she feel trapped in an emotionally abusive relationship? Or was she an active participant who underestimated the consequences of following Aries' anger-driven decisions? When the truth about the crime was fully uncovered, the community's reaction to Aiden's death was one of disbelief. The idea that such a brutal act of violence could happen, especially involving an innocent child, left many feeling numb. The realization that it wasn't just a random road rage incident but a targeted crime created a sense of anger and confusion among the residents. The emotional toll of this crime affected not just Aiden's family, but the entire community. The need for justice became more urgent, and the psychological motivations behind the crime were scrutinized more than ever. As the trial loomed, the question on everyone's mind was whether justice could ever truly be served for Aiden. Could the emotional wreckage caused by Aries and Lee's actions be repaired? And with the court proceedings about to begin, the community watched, waiting for the truth to unfold in full. Would the psychological motivations behind Aiden's death ever be fully understood? And most importantly, would it bring the justice that Aiden so deserved? The trial of Marcus Arise and Win Lee was set to begin, and with it came a flood of emotions. Aiden Leos' family, still reeling from the loss of their young child, now had to prepare themselves for the long, painful process of justice. The community, too, was holding its breath, hoping for the truth to come to light, hoping for justice for a child whose life had been taken so senselessly. As the court proceedings loomed, the question on everyone's mind was whether true justice could ever be served for Aiden. Could the emotional wreckage caused by Arise and Lee's actions ever be repaired? The courtroom was filled with tension the day the trial began. The prosecution was ready to present its case, an undeniable narrative that Marcus Arise had taken the life of an innocent child in a violent outburst of road rage with his accomplice Win Lee. Witnesses had testified about the events leading up to the shooting, describing the erratic behavior of Arise and the terrifying exchange between him and Aiden's mother, Joanna Clunan. The surveillance footage of the Volkswagen following Joanna's car and the final, deadly gunshot that took Aiden's life was presented to the court. It was a clear depiction of the moments that led to that fateful, tragic event. In the early days of the trial, Joanna Clunan herself took the stand. She spoke about the loss of her son with a quiet strength, recounting the horrific moments of that morning on the freeway. Her voice cracked as she described Aiden's final words, how he had cried out in pain after being struck by the bullet. Her testimony was heart-wrenching. Every word she spoke felt like a fresh wound, each one revealing the depth of her grief. But Joanna's testimony was not just a recounting of events. It was a powerful statement about a mother's love for her child, a mother who had done everything she could to protect him, only to see her world shattered by a senseless act of violence. As she spoke, the entire courtroom seemed to feel her pain. The emotional toll of losing a child could never truly be captured in words, but Joanna's courage in standing before the court and sharing her story made it clear how deeply Aiden's death had affected her. The defense, however, tried to argue a different narrative. They attempted to downplay the severity of Arise's actions, claiming that the shooting had been an impulsive act triggered by a momentary fit of road rage. But the prosecution was unwavering. They painted a picture of a man with a history of aggressive driving and emotional volatility, someone who was prone to violent outbursts, someone who had allowed his anger to dictate his actions on that day. It wasn't just a moment of rage, it was a calculated decision to escalate the situation into something deadly. The evidence against him was too strong. The forensic analysis of the bullet, the gunshot residue found on the door of the Volkswagen, the phone records linking Arise and Lee, everything pointed to the fact that this wasn't just a random act of road rage. This was a man who had been fueled by something deeper, and it had resulted in the death of an innocent child. As the trial progressed, Win Lee's involvement came under further scrutiny. She had been the driver of the vehicle that day, and while she hadn't pulled the trigger, her role in the crime was undeniable. The prosecution argued that she had enabled Arise's behavior, actively participating in the road rage incident by tailgating and following Joanna's car. Lee, they said, had chosen to support Arise in his decision to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it. The defense, however, painted Lee as a passive participant, someone caught in a relationship with a man who had made the ultimate decision to take Aiden's life. But the jury was not swayed by these arguments. They knew that Lee had played a critical role in the events that led to Aiden's death, and they held her accountable for her actions. The trial culminated in a moment of intense emotion. The jury deliberated, and after several days, they returned with their verdict. Marcus Arise was convicted of second-degree murder, and Win Lee was found guilty of accessory to the crime. The verdict brought some sense of closure to Aiden's family, but the pain of the loss would never truly go away. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was filled with anticipation. The family of Aiden Leos, though exhausted by the emotional toll of the trial, still held out hope that the justice system would deliver a sentence fitting for the horrific crime that had been committed. Marcus Aries was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison, a harsh reminder that no matter how brief the moment of rage, the consequences of taking a life would be felt for decades. Win Lee was sentenced to a lesser term, though she would still serve a significant time in prison for her role in the crime. The court acknowledged her complicity in the crime, but her sentence reflected the fact that she had not been the one to pull the trigger. However, the weight of her actions still loomed large, and the judge made it clear that she, too, would be held accountable for the choices she made that day. As the sentencing was read aloud, Aiden's family sat in silence. For them, the verdicts didn't bring their son back, nor could they erase the pain of losing him in such a senseless and violent way. But there was a sense of justice that Aiden, in his innocence, had been denied in the most brutal manner. The impact of the trial on Aiden's family was immeasurable. In the months and years that followed the trial, they would carry the weight of the loss in different ways. For Joanna, the pain of losing Aiden never truly went away. She continued to speak publicly about her son, sharing his memory with the world, while also advocating for changes to road safety and advocating for the prevention of violence. For the rest of Aiden's family, the emotional toll was felt daily. They had to reconcile the fact that Aiden's death had not been some random tragedy but a direct consequence of a violent act, one that could have been avoided had the circumstances been different. There would always be a hole in their hearts, one that no verdict or sentence could ever fill. But they found solace in the support of the community and the fact that justice had been served, even if it could never fully heal their wounds. As for the community, Aiden's death remained a painful reminder of the fragility of life and the destructive potential of unchecked anger. They came together in support of Aiden's family, and in the aftermath of the trial, they found a way to honor his memory. Memorials were held, and Aiden's story was shared across social media and news outlets, ensuring that his life, though tragically short, would never be forgotten. But as the years passed, the question remained, was the justice system enough to bring peace to a family that had lost everything? Could this have been prevented? Could Aiden's bright future have been spared if someone had only taken a moment to breathe, to think, before reacting out of anger? These are questions that will haunt not just his family, but anyone who hears his story. Aiden's death serves as a stark reminder of how unchecked emotions, whether anger, frustration, or something deeper, can lead to irreversible consequences. It's a call to action for society to recognize the importance of mental health, emotional regulation, and the need for accountability. Every life, no matter how young, is precious. It's vital that we work together to prevent similar tragedies from occurring, not just by addressing road rage, but by fostering a culture of patience, understanding, and compassion. As we reflect on Aiden's life and his untimely death, we are reminded that justice, while important, is not the end of the story. The lessons we learn from this tragedy must guide us in how we treat one another, how we control our impulses, and how we ensure that no other family has to endure such heartache. What are your thoughts on this tragedy? Can we do more to prevent such senseless acts of violence? Let us know in the comments. Your perspective matters, and together, we can keep Aiden's memory alive, ensuring that his death was not in vain. Thank you for watching and taking the time to reflect on Aiden's story with us. If this case has left you thinking deeply, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on future stories that explore the truth behind real-life mysteries and tragedies. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the case and the impact it's had on the community? Do you think the justice system did enough, or could more have been done? Comment below with your theories or reflections. We read every comment, and your voice matters. And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll dive into another gripping true crime case, uncovering even more hidden truths. The stories are just getting started, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Subscribe now, and together, let's continue uncovering the truth.